share my screen. So howdy, I am Lei, the CBA. I am the Community Volunteer Ambassador for the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. I'm going to go ahead and read our general consent statement. So as a visible disclosure, we'd like to inform any participants that any and all Zoom series is and will be recorded. The purpose of this is to provide the Zoom series to those who participated or missed out on the session. It is also provided the information for participants to refer back to. In addition to the visible disclosure, this statement will be orally stated at the beginning of each Zoom series, like I am right now. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it off.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I want to welcome Justin Brown, who is a biologist at Santa Monica Mountains. He has been doing a lot of really cool research with wildlife. And I know that we talked a little bit about it a couple of months ago about the SCAT program. Just briefly talked about that he would be coming and talking about it, but he's also going to be talking to us about 405 and wildlife studies and things like that. So Justin has been with the park, you said 10 years now, Justin?
Yep.
Yeah, so he's got a lot of great research, and I really appreciate him coming and sharing the work that he's been doing with everybody so that we can all learn a little bit about wildlife in urban areas. So I'll hand it off to you, Justin. Thank you.
All right, great. It's great to be here with you all. Nice to see everybody's faces. So I'll go ahead and start my screen share here. So as Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about two different subjects. They kind of overlap a little bit because coyotes are involved in both studies we'll be talking about. I'm going to start off talking about coyotes and some of the work we've done specifically in LA, but it's kind of a little bit more broad than that. Kind of looking more generally like the Southern California area. And then I'm going to be talking about some work we're doing with Caltrans and looking at wildlife permeability and how we're trying to work to improve their wildlife's ability to get across 405 and some of the issues we're seeing. So I'll start off by talking about the coyotes. So for all of our animals to basically get a good feel of how they're using the landscape and just get general information about what they're doing, their health and all that, first we start off by capturing them. And then we fit them with radio collars so we can radio track them around, which I'm sure you've heard from any of the other wildlife folks that have spoke already. That's kind of our preferred method to understand how they're using the landscape and what's killing them, because by having these radio collars, it gives us information when they die. We know that they died, so we can go get them. Look at sources of mortality. We can look at how they're moving around the landscape. We can see if multiple animals are coming into contact, if we have a bunch of different animals collared. There's a lot of different things we can do with these collars. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the radio tracking data for coyotes. I am going to spend more time talking about the diet work. But I will show some maps here to start off. So we've collared coyotes in a bunch of different areas here locally. Down in the LA area, we've collared, I think we're at 6 animals we've had down like in the near downtown Los Angeles. We've had animals off the 405, which actually we've had 6 animals in the 405 area where it's only showing 1 here currently. San Fernando Valley, this animal here, the C147, this one was super interesting. So I should explain what you're looking at here. So there's 3 different polygons. The green one basically just incorporates all the points. So when we run home ranges, we kind of look at it at different scales. And like the yellow, the red one would incorporate basically about 50% of the animal's points. But what you can see here is that, say, C147, this one animal's whole home range was larger than almost the study areas for any of these other studies. And that's all because this animal was a transient and it bounced around. This animal is super cool because it's one of the few animals we've documented across the 101. You can see that in the middle of its home range. If I can find my pointer here, you can see right here where it crossed, which was near Canaan. And so it's really cool to have an animal that's successfully made it across 101, since that's one of our big issues with the Santa Monica Mountains wildlife, is that there's very little permeability. And then some other road studies we've done where coyotes have been involved. We've done some work out on the 118 between Moore Park and Ventura. This isn't a major freeway, but it is quite busy. It's farmland type areas. And it is one road that blocks animals from being able to get to the Santa Monicas up into Los Padres. And this study was quite interesting. And actually at some point, maybe I should do another talk specifically about that project. And then the 126 study, we also call out a bunch of coyotes up there looking at 126 and permeability there. And we're also currently doing some other road studies. I'm currently working on one out along 5, so out in this area, looking at how animals are getting across the 5. So I want to just let you kind of give you an idea. We talk a lot about urban animals, yet it's hard to picture what is an urban animal, because it can vary a lot. It can vary from animals hanging out on the edge where they're just occasionally coming into urban areas to where they're just living somewhere out in rural, but there's a lot of just different human use, to things like this, where you see these animals are living right next to downtown Los Angeles. So this is Dodger Stadium in the center of the view here. So this is Elysian Park. I consider downtown Los Angeles this is where all the big buildings are, right in here. So it kind of gives you a feel for what we're looking at here. And so these animals are incredibly urban. They're using areas that, truthfully, when I first went down there, especially this one in blue, I worked in Chicago for a long time working with coyotes and seeing some pretty urban animals. And when I went down here and visited these sites, I was like, yeah, they may be coming through, but they're probably not here very often, until we collared one and quickly learned that the C-144, as soon as we caught her, we saw she had pups right there. So we knew she was a resident, had settled in. But you can see these animals are they're setting up home ranges. They're not just dispersing in and out. For most of these animals, these clump of locations, so each color is a different animal, that they're not just bouncing in and out. For most of these, this is about a little bit less than a year's worth of data. The one that is longer is C-149, this green one. That's actually 3 years worth of data for that animal. And you can see it kind of bounce around in there a fair bit along the LA River and out in the hills. So out of all these animals, they were all residents, which basically means they set up a territory and that's where they live their life. They have their mate, or they have offspring and they form packs. The offspring disperses out, but they maintain their territory. There's one of these animals that actually end up breaking away from being a pack animal, which is the C-146, which are these yellow and black dots. And you can see underneath C-149 here, there was a bunch of points of her. This is Rio de La State Park. The animal lived pretty consistently for about 3-4 months, just staying in the park. Then all of a sudden it started showing these signs of dispersal. Crossed the 101 freeway here, going down into Elysian Park, or sorry, is that the 101? No, it's not 101. 5, sorry. Crossing the 5 into Elysian Park, bounced around Elysian Park, came back, ended up coming down the LA River down into where all the train areas, I don't even know what they really call that. And then bounced back, and then it eventually dispersed into Elysian, spent a bunch more time in Elysian, then went down in here to where C-144 is. You can see some points intermingled here. And this animal got very unfortunate, ended up at MacArthur Park and ended up in the lake there and ended up drowning in the lake. Which when you look at MacArthur Park Lake, like you think, well, coyotes, they can swim, they shouldn't drown. But when you look at this lake, this is what it looks like. You can see there's a solid barrier all the way around it. So if animals end up in there, there's really not much chance of them getting out. And so that animal ended up in the lake, and who knows why it ended up in there. It could have been chasing one of these ducks or geese, or it grew up on the LA River. It may have just been used to swimming and didn't realize it couldn't get out. And so that kind of gives you a feel of some of these urban coyotes and how they're moving around the landscape. So when we've gone out and tracked them, there's lots of cool things we get to see. This is an example of one of them. This is a coyote running right by a German Shepherd. The German Shepherd was going crazy. The coyote didn't really care at all. Coyote just kind of kept marching on down the road. I mean, they're getting barked at constantly by dogs. They're very used to dealing with the human pet interaction type stuff, because they're just always in those scenarios. Crossing roads is obviously a major obstacle for these animals living in these urban areas. And the one cool thing about radio tracking that I got to see is, and I saw this in Chicago, I've seen it here, is that these animals, they learn how to watch road patterns. They'll stop at the edge of the road, kind of stand there and watch. They'll back up a little bit if they hear cars coming. And eventually, once there's no cars, they'll go across. And I think that's one of the reasons coyotes, besides them being able to eat a lot of different things, which I'll talk about more here in a minute, is that they are smart enough that they're able to kind of figure out roadways. Obviously, some are still getting hit by cars, but for the number of animals that are out there and as frequently as they're crossing roads, there's really not that many animals getting struck. Like they figure it out. They're quite smart, these coyotes. So as I mentioned, I was going to talk more about diet. So I started off interested in diet just because, like with these urban animals, we really do need to understand how are they persisting in these urban environments? What are they feeding on? I mean, that's an incredibly important item for these animals to be able to live in urban areas. And so early on, I was picking up mortalities to collect samples for disease testing. And as part of that, I just decided to necropsy some of the animals out. And so here, I just kind of put a quick list together of what some of the things are we saw just in stomach contents. And it varies greatly here. You can see from gophers to gophers, squirrels, reptiles, those type things, up to fruits, which no one ever thinks about fruits and coyotes eating fruits. And that's one of the things I think our work has really shown is how important some of these fruits can be for these coyotes. But also lots of human-based foods, things like barbecue chicken, pet foods, those type items, as well as all the ornamental fruits that we have, apples, guavas, palms, grapes, all those type items. So you can see they eat a lot of different things. The one that I found interesting, and I've cut up lots of coyotes over the years from roadkills and stuff, and I've only seen possums. A possum's an animal you think coyotes would have no problems catching. They're slow, don't seem overly intelligent, yet I never see them in the coyotes, and we really didn't see them in scat or any of that as I'll go forward here. But this animal that did eat it was in the worst shape I've ever seen for a coyote. So in addition to just this cutting up animals, I would always obviously pay attention when I was radio tracking them to see what they're feeding on. We'd see them feed on pet food quite often around LA. Seeing them feed on small mammals, catching them near trash cans, seeing them pick up dead birds, and then chasing and feeding on a domestic cat. So here's just some of the images we've gotten from trail cameras, which was kind of some of our other early information about what coyotes were eating. So you can see, obviously this one's eating a rabbit. We had one pick up a watermelon, which I never thought I'd see that. That seemed pretty unbelievable that they would be able to find a watermelon and then haul it off like that. And then we would get a photo of it. What are the odds? And then domestic cats. So with some of this preliminary data, it kind of got me motivated more to start a large scale diet study, just trying to get a better feel for what these animals were doing. And at the time, we actually had an intern that was just leaving that had done some work down in San Diego doing a bunch of scat work. And she was interested in starting grad school. And so between me and her, we started this large scale diet study to try to get a better feel of what coyotes are eating. And so we decided we were going to go at it two different methods. First was scat. The volunteer program was incredibly important for the scat project. There's no way we could have ever collected and dissected over 3,000 scats without the amazing volunteers that participated in the scat program. We had hundreds of different folks come through and help with this project over the life of it, over the 2 years we did it. Volunteers helped collect scats, but they also helped dissect scats. And so it was pretty amazing. We had a pretty good solid group of folks that participated. And then the second part is stable isotopes. So stable isotopes is interesting because you can tell it works great in some aspects. So for like looking to see how much human food animals are eating, it's great because we eat a ton of corn. Corn is a C4 plant and captures a lot of carbon-13, which is basically just a heavy isotope of carbon. Where most of our native plants don't do that. They're all C3 plants. And so they're not nearly as effective at capturing C13 out of the environment. And so their numbers are a lot lower. So when an animal eats, say, something that has a lot of corn in it, it ends up showing a ton of that carbon-14. shows at a much higher level. And so we can use that to kind of look and see, well, how much of this carbon 13 is carbon 13 is showing up in these animals' diets. And also I'll show you some graphs and stuff of some of the data as I go through here, but I'll start off talking a little bit more about what the different prey categories are and where we were kind of interested. So obviously there's native animals that they could be feeding on, things like wood rats, squirrels, gophers, rabbits, different types of reptiles, as well as insects. And there are some native fruits, though they aren't super common. In terms of general coyote diets, there's things like I want to call it choke cherry, but that's not the right name. The holly leaf cherry that they do eat lots, and they can in certain places where they really will take advantage of them. But generally, when you see fruits in this environment, most of the time it's these anthropogenic fruits. Like if you're out there hiking and you see a scat that has fruit in it, it usually ends up being some sort of anthropogenic. So anthropogenic just means human-based, human-related. And so that's the other prey category that we were particularly interested in, is how much human-related foods are these coyotes getting? And some of the things that we saw quite common were things like figs, grapes, domestic cats, things like junk food. We'd find wrappers. Like most of the human foods are highly digestible. And that's why the stable isotope stuff is important. And I'll talk more about that as we go here. But that's why we did stable isotopes, because so many of our food sources, like fast food, it's not going to pass through in the scat. And the scat, the only thing we can identify are the hard parts that come through. So it's got to be bones, feathers, seeds, exoskeletons, those type things that allow us to identify what was in this, what they digested, or I guess technically what they didn't digest. And then non-native rats are kind of a human-based food source as well, because we brought them in. They really occur mostly in the urban environments. And they really are taking advantage of a lot of our food resources that aren't kind of a natural, shouldn't be in the natural system. Okay, so I'll jump straight into the graphs of the scat data. So basically we kind of broke it up based on natural foods and human related foods. So this first one is 1,000 Oaks. And you can see, so the one things to watch, so the next graph is going to be LA. And so the thing that you'll see is currently you can see this is 0 to 100%. So 100% means every single scat we found had that item in it. And so let's say, so a good example of that on this graph is mammals. So under our native mammals, let's see, I think I've got the numbers. 97% of scats had some sort of native mammal in them in Thousand Oaks, which is interesting, right? That shows that these native mammals are incredibly important for these animals living around Thousand Oaks. But then as you look through it, they also, under natural foods, they're eating a decent amount of vertebrates, around 10% invertebrates, around 10%. They're also eating birds and reptiles as well. And so but then when you go start looking at what are these animals eating in terms of our food resources. So about 25% of the scats had some sort of ornamental fruit in them. In Thousand Oaks, we saw a ton of grapes. Grapes were pretty common, especially on certain areas where we collected it from. But we also see a ton of ficus. Ficus is common both in LA and in Thousand Oaks. And ficus, some people call them figs. Indian laurel fig is a common name for one of the most common ones. But basically, if you walk underneath a tree and there's tons of little black, purple stains on the ground, and the tree looks like this big, lush tree with kind of a white trunk, you're walking underneath that tree. They're everywhere around LA. They're super common. And they're a really pretty tree, but they're very messy, and coyotes take advantage of that because they produce quite a bit of fruit. So other things to notice here, pet food, not very much, which pet food through scat is very hard to identify. And so when we get to stable isotopes, it's more of a better example of pet food. So you can take this kind of with a grain of salt in terms of pet food. Domestic animals, quite low, around 5%. Cats accounting for the majority of that. And then trash, also quite low, around about 5%. So now let's look at LA and see how this all changes. So it changes quite drastically here, right? Now you start looking at trash. So notice that the bar on the left-hand side is now 50% instead of 100%. So you can't quite think about the height of the bars. You have to actually pay attention to the numbers here. So trash went from about 5% up to about 25% of scats having trash in them. Ornamental fruits jumped not too much higher, but it's about 30% here, whereas about 25% in Thousand Oaks. But the thing to notice is this gray one, which is the figs or the ficus, really jumped up in LA. And it just makes sense because they're everywhere there. And they produce fruit almost, I wouldn't say year round, but there's a good chunk of the year that they're producing fruit. The other one that really jumps up that you'll notice is domestic animals. And so you can see cats. Cats are quite a large part of it. I mean, 20% of the scats we collected from LA had cat in them, which there's very few studies for looking at coyotes and what they're feeding on that have seen cat numbers this high. Usually it's somewhere around 1%, 2%, 3%. But in LA, there's just a lot of outdoor cats, a lot of feral cat colonies. And so these animals are taking advantage of them. And so then when you jump over and look at natural foods, obviously this bar for natural foods for mammals looks quite high, just like it did for Thousand Oaks. But when you start thinking about it, it's actually half the height of the other one because it's only going up to about 47%. I think it's 47%, 43%. And so it's really, they're still eating native mammals and taking advantage of those prey sources, but it's not as common as it is in Thousand Oaks. They really are more reliant upon things that we have out in the environment. They're eating a ton of human-related foods, with 65% of scats having some sort of human-related food in there. And so to me, what this screams is that there's a lot we can do with people that are having coyote problems. It's really about reducing food resources to them. And so I think that's the one cool thing about what this study has shown us is that there's a lot we can do to reduce when a neighborhood's having coyote problems. We just need to make sure there's not human food resources available. That's why the coyotes are coming in. And then you can see inverts, birds, reptiles, they're all roughly the same as they were in Thousand Oaks. So the next graph I'm going to show is a little more complicated. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but this is basically what the standard graph looks like for stable isotopes. I know this is complicated, but basically all you really need to look at is this line down the middle. Everything to the right of this basically means that these animals' diet is consisting highly of anthropogenic food items or human food items. Everything to the left of it, that's not the case. So each one of these diamonds, so you can see over here on the left, there's a key. So the diamonds are the urban animals, the squares, so these kind of gray squares are the suburban, and then these light gray triangles are the animals that were collected from rural areas. And so you can see none of the rural animals cross that bar. They're all kind of eating more natural food sources. And by rural, these are animals that are out in agricultural countries. So there's still human food resources because there's still lots of houses around. There's still ag for them to be feeding on. So there are things for them to be eating out there, but they're clearly not eating enough of those to cross over into these anthropogenic. Then when you look at the urban animals, which are these black diamonds, most of them are feeding on heavy levels of human food resources. And then the black squares, it's kind of a hodgepodge, basically. Some are, some aren't. And so these colored dots are just, so when you do stable isotopes, to kind of get a feel for where animals fall, we have to collect from some of the prey sources. So like this green is figs, the purple is insects, the blues are native mammals and squirrels, this kind of light blue. Sorry, I have an extra one here. I can't quite remember what the deal is here now. It's been a little bit since I've looked at this one. And then up here we have, this is cats. This pink one is pet foods, which we published a paper on this about 6-9 months ago. And what was interesting is we didn't include pet foods in it because there wasn't numbers out there for us to use, but post that paper, another paper came out that had some values that we could use. And so once we put pet foods in, it was super interesting because they popped in right in the middle of all of our animals once we started looking at it. So pet foods are clearly an important factor for these coyotes. And then this bottom, we basically looked to see what human foods equaled. And to do that, we basically just took human hair and analyzed it like we would analyze the samples from a coyote. I'm not gonna spend much time here, but basically you can see the stable isotope work showed again, pet foods are important. There's both Los Angeles by far it was much more common in the animals in Los Angeles eating huge proportions of pet food as well as cats, where Thousand Oaks was lower, but still pet foods were pretty common, cats quite a bit lower. and then rural, both were quite a bit lower than what you see in the other two areas. So I think the message here is that coyotes, if they can find human food resources, they're going to take advantage of it. So things like old Wiley eating cans isn't too far off from reality. So I just wanted to give you guys some kind of general information about coyotes because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Coyotes in LA, I hear people saying, oh, it's a 60-pound coyote. 60-pound coyotes do not occur in LA. Like, they're just not here. Most of them are right around 30 pounds. Most animals I've caught are somewhere between 25 and 30 pounds. They do form family groups. So you'll see times when people say, oh, I'm seeing 10 coyotes. Totally possible they're seeing 10 coyotes. However, most of those are probably young from that year. It's not that there's a pack of 10 adult coyotes. Usually it's like this. So even in this photo, you can see here, these three in front are clearly young of the year, and then you've got the adult in the background. And that's much more common when people are saying they're seeing tons of animals. There can be more than 2 adults. There's usually an alpha pair, and then sometimes offspring from the year before, or even the year before that, can still hang out, but there's usually only 1 or 2 of those still in the range. So usually when you're hearing these large numbers, it's because the offspring are still around. And those usually start dispersing out early summer before the next litter, or sorry, not, early fall before the next round of pups are getting ready to be born. So coyotes do live in many large urban areas. It's not specific just to LA. I mean, Chicago had coyotes move in the 80s, 90s. They're there throughout the area now. Even New York City now has coyotes living in it. So there's lots of different cities. Pretty much you can almost name a city in the US and there's coyotes living there. They are native to Southern California. A lot of people don't believe that's the case. They think they moved into LA. That's definitely not true. Coyotes are the 3rd most common species in the La Brea tar pits. As well as historically, there's tons of historical records from early LA where there's news stories where people are talking about having issues with coyotes or coyotes being around. And so the one thing I hear all the time is that they weren't here and now all of a sudden they're here. They've always been here. There might be areas where they got extirpated from, but they have always been around the area. Home range sizes, they're not using a significantly different size home range than what animals do in natural areas. So a lot of times people think animals in urban areas use larger home ranges. If anything, our urban animals actually seem to be using smaller home ranges. I need to do more research and I'd like to color a few more animals so I can kind of narrow that down a little bit because my sample sizes are a little small to make any broad statements. But right now it's looking like home ranges are a little bit smaller for these urban animals, which basically means there's more resources. And the resources we're seeing them use are human foods. So it's quite clear that we probably are playing some factor in how many coyotes there are around. So let's see. They are common throughout LA and they do occur in most of the urban areas around LA. I get reports from almost everywhere. If you get on iNaturalist, they're popping in all over the place. I'm going to jump to the next thing because I do want to cover some 405 stuff and I'm not sure. It's taking me a little longer to get through this than I was thinking. Things people should know to avoid conflict. Don't feed the coyotes. So many people are feeding coyotes in LA. I've seen places in Griffith Park where people are just intentionally dropping food off. Tracking these animals, I see places where people are just putting bowls of food out there for the animals. It just creates these animals to become much more habituated to us, which is what we don't want. Pets should be kept indoors. Cats obviously can be a food item for coyotes. A lot of people think coyotes can't jump a 6-foot fence. They can very easily jump a 6-foot fence. I've seen them do it a bunch. However, they do prefer to go underneath fences. And so it's really important to make sure there's no holes underneath the fence if you don't want coyotes in your yard. If you want to keep coyotes completely out, you really do need at least an 8-foot fence, or you need something so they can't touch the top of the fence. And so it's just keeping them from being able to hit that top. And so 6-foot fence can work if there is something up there, such as a coyote roller or something so they can't land on the top of the fence. Any dog under 30 pounds or smaller in stature than a coyote, they are at risk. Coyotes do attack dogs. And that's just a thing with the canid world in general. Wolves kill coyotes, coyotes kill foxes. So that's not like they're just targeting dogs. That's just how the canid world works. If there's a den in somewhere around, I recommend people try to keep their dogs at least 200 meters away from it. That's when coyotes do get extra protective, is during that breeding or the season when they're pupping season. Another thing I always ask people, I know people like watching coyotes, but if you do see them somewhere where in a neighborhood or somewhere where they're could easily get accustomed to people, I recommend scaring them off. You're not going to drastically change where they live, what they do. But at least if we keep scaring them, it'll show them that we aren't friendly. We don't want them to start coming up and thinking we provide food resources. There are so many people feeding them that it's important that the people that aren't are kind of aggressive with them and keep them scared of us. So hazing is something that I'm sure many of you have probably heard about around coyotes. Basically what it comes down to is just being aggressive with them, being loud, not letting them feel comfortable. So I've got a bunch of different things here listed out that you could see that you can do to try to scare them off. The biggest thing is that when you do scare them, you kind of change things up. Like if you have to do it multiple times, you're not always doing the same thing with them. Like you're not always just yelling and waving your hands. Sometimes you're throwing something at them. Sometimes you have something really loud that you're shaking. Sometimes you're just yelling and raising your hands. So it just kind of always, they don't know what to expect from us. Is an important thing in keeping them from becoming habituated with us. So when you are hazing, make eye contact with the animal. Don't stay inside your house and yell at them. Go out, make yourself big. Don't haze from behind a bush. I hear people saying, oh, I tried to scare them, but I didn't really make myself big and seen. I yelled at them from in my house. They didn't go away. Of course, they're not going to go away. They're used to loud noises, things happening. They're not used to people coming out and being aggressive with them. So you can yell, go away. Step towards the animal. I don't say keep approaching it. If it's not running away, obviously don't get too close, but just let it know that you're not scared of it. You're bigger, you're much more aggressive than it is. Make lots of noise. I recommend people, especially animals that are very habituated, that aren't already kind of showing any natural fear, is you do probably need to go to the next level and have something like a metal can with coins in it, something that can make a lot of noise that you can then throw at the animal as well. You just kind of need to be extra aggressive once animals are already getting habituated to us. And once an animal gets habituated, it is really hard to back them back out of that. So it's going to take a lot of work. And you may not ultimately be effective. It may have to come down to other means to reduce if animals get too habituated. But it's also important when you do haze them that you continue hazing them until the animal's completely out of the scene. And just because the coyote stops to look at you doesn't mean that they're not afraid. They're a lot of times looking to see if you're chasing them or if they should still be frightened of you. And so we recommend just to continue scaring them away. All right, so with that, I'm going to jump over and talk about the 405 project. I'm going to try to go through this a little faster. So one of the places in Sepulveda Pass that we're studying is Skirball Bridge, which you can see here, and it's very lit up at night. This is at like 1 o'clock in the morning. So not a great place for wildlife, you'd think. There's plenty of issues you can see there. The nice thing is both sides of the road, you see dark over here. This is the east side, this is the west side. So there are places animals could feel safe away from the roadway. But our goal is to get them across 405. So we have one population instead of having all this fragmentation. So what are the issues in Sepulveda Pass area? There's limited permeability for wildlife. 405 and Sepulveda Boulevard combined make 14 lanes of traffic, which is about 100 meters wide. And this area gets a little bit less than 300,000 vehicles a day through it. And so that's a pretty significant barrier. So what are we doing to try to help understand what we might be able to do to get animals across this? Well, first we're doing a larger scale study there. We've captured and radio collared 5 different species, technically 6 different species, including mountain lions. And you can see those species here: coyotes, bobcats, gray fox, raccoons, mule deer, to see how they're approaching the road and if they are going over any of the crossings. We also have put out cameras at all the crossings as well as away from the crossings. And we've done roadkill surveys along Sepulveda Boulevard. And this section of just 405 generally in LA is one of the busiest roads interstates in the country. And so it's a pretty crazy area. And so just so you have a feel of what we're trying to achieve is we're basically trying to connect Griffith Park and the Hollywood Hills to the Santa Monica Mountains so that this smaller area of the Hollywood Hills isn't fragmented from the larger Santa Monica Mountains. So this is kind of a smaller scale version of what the issue with the Santa Monica Mountains is between the Santa Monica Mountains and Los Padres. It's still a separation that is being put on it because of a major freeway that we've put in. So the data will be used to identify some of the best locations for mitigation, identify some of the important habitats that animals are using, and then identify where we might be able to make some improvements to help get animals between the Santa Monicas and the Hollywood Hills. So with the camera monitoring, we've picked up a lot of different species, which is great. It tells us that there's a lot of animals there that we might be able to help out and create more habitat where they're not so disjunct. And so these are the 4 potential crossing points we identified: Mulholland Bridge, Skirball Bridge, Bel Air Underpass, and Sepulveda Underpass. The blue dots you see next to the road, so these are cameras we put away from the road so we could see what wildlife was moving through the area that may not be approaching these potential crossing points. And so there's cameras at these blue spots as well as at each one of these potential crossing locations. Some of these had up to 8 cameras at them. So we were doing a pretty good job of covering locations that we thought animals were likely to use under these underpasses or on the bridges. So here, we'll start off here talking about Mulholland Bridge. And so if you look at the photos up at top, there's a pre-photo on the left-hand side of the screen, a post photo in the middle. And so there big changes happened as part of the construction they did to widen the 405, which everyone probably heard about as Carmageddon. Basically what they were doing is they were putting a carpool lane in, trying to widen the road a little bit, which affected all these bridges. So they had to do work on these different bridges to make it so that they could put this carpool lane in. So on Mulholland, pre-construction, there used to be a sidewalk, very permeable from the area next to it onto the sidewalk. So you can see it's this graded fence, and even at the end of the graded fence, most of the fencing was down. So animals were pretty easily able to get out here. The sidewalk obviously is old, vegetation growing in it here and there. There's a barricade between the sidewalk and the Mulholland Road, where when you look at it post, so this is the same corner, but it's significantly different. So this is where the chain link used to be that was all down. It's solid concrete now, so no real way for animals to get through there. This barrier is much more secure than this one that has just bars going down through it. There's no more barricade. They've taken that out. And so it's just a lot more open, and animals are not able to get from the adjacent habitat quickly onto the bridge and therefore across. And you can see that you can see that in our data pretty clearly that animals went. So if you look at this graph down below, Mulholland wasn't monitored the whole study period. It wasn't identified by Caltrans initially as a potential crossing point for Mulholland or for across the 405. So there was never any talk about doing it, and we actually pushed to start the monitoring. And so we basically got 1 season in before they started the construction efforts. What they call the construction efforts. They didn't actually start construction on Mulholland Bridge until the winter of 2012, which you can see right in here. And that's when it pretty much dropped to 0 and we started seeing no wildlife coming onto the bridge. So you can kind of effectively consider from fall of 11, spring of 2010 as the pre-construction monitoring period. And you can see we had a lot of different species going out onto the bridge, where once construction started, it dropped to 0, and even post-construction, the wildlife really never came back and started using the Mulholland Bridge. Okay, let's look at Skirball. And so at Skirball, it's interesting because Caltrans actually identified Skirball Bridge as the place that they could try to do some mitigation to help wildlife. And so they did. So pre-construction, there were sidewalks on both sides of the road. Both of them had these kind of barricades. It was kind of open. However, we didn't pick up a ton of wildlife on our cameras. You can see we did get some, nothing compared to Mulholland. There was 1 season where coyotes were there constantly using the bridge. But other than that, there wasn't a ton of use. So they put in this wildlife sidewalk, and in terms of placement, it looks really good. Lots of natural area on the east side of the road. The west side of the road, they do have to come across Sepulveda Boulevard. but no matter where they put any sort of mitigation in, you're going to have another road that animals have to cross in addition to 405. And so it's just something they were going to have to deal with. And so they put this in on the south side of the bridge, with the thought that hopefully they could jump into, let's see, I think, nope. Coming up, I'll show you there's kind of a stepping stone area here on this side of the bridge where they thought animals could kind of get there, wait for traffic patterns, then go across. But that doesn't really work out the way it's currently designed. So Skirball Bridge still needs a lot of work, and I'll talk more about some of the mitigation as we go forward here. Bel Air Crest, so this is the one saving grace for 405. And as you can see in the graph below, animals use it the whole time, through construction, everything. And you can see up here during construction, they did a fair bit of work. They increased the width of the bridge over the underpass, yet animals still continue to use it. And I think the things that are interesting about Bel Air Crest that doesn't occur at, say, the next crossing we'll talk about, which is Sepulveda, is that there's a lot of vegetation there. Even during construction, that community pretty much tried to keep it as normal looking as possible. And so there was always some level of vegetation on one side of the underpass, pretty much at all times. So it's all non-native vegetation. And so there's obviously this push to not have non-native vegetation growing out there, always afraid of it escaping. However, for wildlife, they just view it as cover. And so for them, they don't care if it's native or not. So for these underpasses, there's some value in having non-native plants growing, just so the animals have that feeling of cover. So in the graph, the one thing you can see is that it also goes from a lot of orange to a lot more of the green, which the orange are coyotes and the green are deer, which is, it's interesting, and I can't explain why this switch happened. But it is a really cool switch in that mule deer are one of the harder species to get across freeways, yet they're still willing to use this underpass under Bel Air, which is a road. There's a lot of issues there. There's a lot of cars. They still have to go across Sepulveda Boulevard. So I think it's a really cool example of something that might work for mule deer and something that people need to think about. And it might be that this vegetation, as well as there being multiple flat areas. So up on top of this bridge, so up here, there's a flat area, as well as down here by the pillars, there's a nice big flat area. And so there's places the animals can walk pretty easily. And so I think there's just kind of a combination of things happening there that allow them to feel more comfortable. So the next one I'm going to jump down to is where Sepulveda goes under the 405. And prior to construction, there was a decent amount of use there. You can see, I mean, many different species going under it. Like, we were detecting animals pretty frequently, and it just kind of slowly dropped off during the construction phase, which isn't unexpected. Like, I mean, obviously a lot of people activity was there. They did a lot of work under this bridge, as well as they also stationed their work crews in 2 different areas directly adjacent to the bridge. So hopefully you all can see my cursor, but up here on the, so north is over here. So on the northwest side, they turned this into a big construction yard. And on the northeast side, they also turned this into a big construction yard. And they took out all the vegetation here as they redid the on-ramp. And so they did a ton of changes right next to this underpass. And I think that explains a lot of the reason we saw this drop. And I think wildlife never really returned post-construction. However, the vegetation still hasn't returned. And so I'm hopeful once the vegetation does recover, we will see an increase there. However, we aren't monitoring it currently. Hopefully we can go back and monitor it at some point in the future and see how much it does change once vegetation recovers. But at this point, we're not doing any further monitoring. So I'm just gonna run through some pictures of some of the different species we saw. Lots of bobcats, bobcat kittens, gray squirrel, mountain lions, coyotes, gray fox. And so as part of this work, we captured a bunch of animals to see how they were moving adjacent to the roadways. As part of our captures, we process them. Obviously, we take blood, we give them fluids, because if they're drugged, we like to give them fluids so they come out well hydrated. We monitor their oxygen levels for things like deer that have issues when you capture them, so you have to be really careful with them. We take measurements, we collar them, we ear tag them, and then we ultimately let them go and then see where they, then use their radio collars to see how they're moving around the landscape. So here's some of the points from the 405 of the different species. The things I want to point out here are the ones that are the most, that are interesting, not necessarily to the 405, but just kind of cool things. You can see this raccoon went way down into incredibly urban areas. He was captured right around here on the 405 and ended up dispersing clear down here, bounced clear back, hung around for about a week around the 405, and then moved up here and ended up moving to this urban area and spending all of its time there. And then this gray fox kind of seems to be pinned in by the 101. Hit the 101 up here, came back, hit the 101 here to the east, and then bounced back and ended up ultimately settling down here. So there's some of the bobcats we marked. I know I'm going a little long here, so I'm just going to kind of fly through some of this. Here's some of the points from some of our animals, from some of the bobcats. So everything that's pink or red was captured on the east. Anything green or blue was captured on the west. Basically, it shows no animals crossed. Gray fox, basically the same thing, no animals crossed. Coyotes, we had one animal cross, this C-157, and it appeared that it might have actually been crossing over the surface of the 405, which is pretty crazy. Mule deer, this animal looks like maybe it crossed some, but I'm kind of wondering if that's just a little bit of an error with my aerial image. I need to go back and do some proofing on some of that data and just see exactly what might be there. Raccoons, they're the one species that crossed a lot. There's a whole story around R18, but basically he ended up getting into rodenticides and dying. He got into one of these bait boxes. We didn't find him dead under a deck. But basically we found that 405 is a significant barrier to animal movement. The construction has definitely been negative for wildlife permeability in the area. Very few animals are crossing. And that these large roads really, they're not a major source of mortality. However, they are a major barrier. So my one hope is that there are lots of animals coming up near the Curveball Center Drive. And so we've put cameras all along this section and we detected a bunch of different species coming pretty close. So coyotes, foxes, lions, raccoons. Some of the mitigation they did, they put in large fencing because we have had several lions die on the freeway as well as coyotes and deer. And then here's what the wildlife sidewalk looks like. And the big issue here is there's really no vegetation. However, it's a natural surface, which is great. And so there's at least some base that we can work with to try to make some improvements. Lighting's an issue, which we've tried to deal with already. And so the one issue here is that stepping stone, which is, this is what I was talking about. So there's a big area here, but it slopes down. So animals on this side can't see it. And then they can't see it from this side once they get near the road because it's blocked by the wall separating them from the 405. So that's basically what they would see looking across Sepulveda Boulevard, just kind of this little tiny strip, but nothing that's clearly to jump off onto. I'm not going to talk about the lion stuff here because I know I'm out of time, but basically we had several lions get hit on the freeway there near the study area. And with that, I can take any questions. How do I get back to the regular screen here?
Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you so much, Justin. We had quite a few come in while you were talking. Some of them you answered along the way, but let me just scroll down through. So one of the questions was, you started out by showing coyotes on the map and where they were located. And one of the questions was, are those overlapping territories representing male and females?
So most of them actually don't overlap. A lot of that was based on scale. We only really had, during the whole time I've studied coyotes in LA, there's only been 2 different animals that actually overlapped at all. And those were the 2 in Elysian Park. And then that weren't on the map, there were some on the 405 that overlapped that were pack mates. But yeah, besides that, they all show very strong territoriality. There's really no overlap in the different animals.
Okay. One of the questions was, what are other current studies of wildlife interacting within larger cities across the US? And I know you talked about that there are coyotes in cities all throughout many different cities in the US, but what are some of the other studies that might be happening in the US?
So I guess, is that related to all wildlife or just particularly coyotes, or?
No, I think they're looking at urban interaction with wildlife, and I think wildlife in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's very broad. There's lots of different professors at different universities doing things. I know there's lots of people looking at bird interaction type stuff, things that are going on. There's studies, there's other coyote studies. So like Chicago has one of the longest running coyote studies pretty much ever. They've handled 1,200 or 1,300 coyotes at this point. Like, they're doing some crazy cool stuff out there. There's also lots of other coyote studies that have reached out to me that I know are doing stuff. Like San Francisco has the coyote study going. Atlanta is starting a coyote study. New York has a coyote study going. So there's a lot of different people doing things out there. I think that's a pretty broad question and hard to like really know, but there's a lot of people looking at that kind of interface and trying to get a better understanding. I mean, it's a growing field, this whole urban wildlife interface. Like, it's something that people used to really dismiss, but as time has gone, it really has caught traction, and there's a lot of people showing interest in it.
Okay, great, thank you. We've had quite a few questions about coyotes and kind of the biology of them, as far as you talked about coyotes having dens. So they typically give birth in dens. But how long do they tend to stay there, and what size of family units do they have?
So coyotes are only using dens during pupping season. They typically are there for until the pups hit around about 4 kilograms, which usually takes about 1.5 to 2 months. I would say probably closer to 1.5 usually. And then once the pups get to that stage around 3.5, 4 kilograms, they're able to run around on their own. They'll still occasionally go back to den sites. But they don't use them consistently. And then once they get up to where they start looking like grown coyotes, none of them use dens. Not saying they won't go sleep underneath somebody's deck, but they're not the typical den that you think of, like what a pup would be in. They don't use those anymore. And so, then in terms of like their pack sizes and stuff, it can vary a lot. I mean, in Chicago, we saw one litter up to 11 pups. And so obviously when those all get to size, you have at least 13 animals there, and more than that, because with a pack that size, I'm sure there were subordinate animals still around helping. So yeah, they can be quite large. I would say around here, we haven't done much pup work in LA. We've put cameras on a few dens, and the largest we've seen was a litter of 6. And so still, even with that, you're talking about a pack of 8 animals once those pups get inside, at a minimum of 8 animals. So right after pupping, I would guess usually there's probably 6 to 8 as part of the pack. And then as those pups disperse, eventually you probably get back down to 2 or 3.
Okay, great. And somebody was asking, how do you know if it's a den or?
How do I know it's a den? So, well, if I see coyotes in it all the time and it's the right time of year, I generally know it's a den. It's a little complicated with dens because they can use a wide variety of things. I've seen them den under decks. And when you go to under a deck, it just looks like it's under a deck. Like, it's hard to tell unless you actually see the animals there. But if you see young pups, generally you know it's a den, or there's a den at least right there somewhere nearby if they're still like, if they're pretty small and not super mobile. But if it's a natural style den, you can usually tell because they're generally about the size of my head and there's fresh digging, there's no cobwebs. There's usually coyote tracks all over the place.
Okay. I know you put collars on kittens or the mountain lion kits. Do you only do, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Do
Sure.
you only put collars on adult coyotes? And there was a question about the weight of these collars that you are putting on animals and wildlife.
Yeah, so I currently only collar adult coyotes. The youngest I'll collar is like a yearling, so somebody that's 9-10 months. It's pretty much full grown. I have collared young animals into about the 3 kilogram range in Chicago. I don't really have any plans to do that here at this point. My project's just not large enough to be thinking about those paths. In terms of the collar weight on the animals, so in the wildlife field, we have some pretty strong criteria in what's allowed. We basically, the collar can't go over 4% of, well, I personally won't go over 4% of the animal's body weight. People go up to 5%. And so there's this kind of limit, and if possible, we keep it around 3% when feasible.
Okay.
So I know that question probably came in with that one picture of the coyote with that kind of large looking collar. That was by far the largest collar I've ever put on a coyote, and I hated that collar. But it worked well, and the animal didn't have any negative repercussions from it. Like, it looked healthy. That animal's still running. I still get photos of it. And actually, I'm sure Tori has probably seen some of those photos because that's the animal by Rio de LA.
That's great. So here are a couple of questions about prey and predator. You talked about the diet that they have. So are they kind of scavenger? Will they eat dead animals, or do they prefer live animals? And in reverse, what preys on them? What are their natural predators?
Yeah, so in terms of what they'll eat, coyotes will eat anything. Like, I mean, I've seen boots inside their stomachs. So there's not a whole lot that they're not going to take advantage of. If it's edible, they're going to try to eat it. And they definitely scavenge roadsides. I'm sure many of you have probably seen coyotes pick up roadkill off the road. Like, a lot of times when you see coyotes hanging by the roadside, a lot of times they're sitting there either waiting to cross or they're looking for roadkill. And then in terms of them being preyed upon, I mean, humans are their main source of predation. However, there's also lions kill them occasionally. So other than that, there's not a whole lot. I mean, wolves, if you're in areas with wolves, but obviously that's not our issue here in Southern California.
Okay. A couple of other questions that came in. How long do offspring stay with their parents?
So that can vary a lot from the individual to individual. I would say the majority of them stay for around 8 to 9 months. However, there's animals that can stay with their parents for multiple years. And so you've probably heard me mention alphas, which is the breeding pair, but then the betas are all those offspring that have stuck around for multiple years. And so beta just means they're kind of the subordinate or the kind of helper animals. And they usually, those are generally believed not to ever breed until they disperse away from their parents. And it's interesting because no one really understands how that works, why those betas don't breed, but no one's ever documented them breeding.
And do coyotes, are they very protective of their home range from other coyotes?
Yeah, I mean, you hear of coyote fights every once in a while, but it seems like I want to say it's kind of more of almost a natural respect or fear of the other pack. Like, there's not, it doesn't seem like they fight very often. They kind of establish their boundaries through scent marking, as well as howling and barking and all those other auditory cues as well, and animals just, they kind of learn their boundaries. It's super interesting. In Chicago, I had a lot more chances there to actually go out and radio track, and we had a lot more animals collared than I have here. And so we would have pairs of animals collared at times, and you would go out and track them, and they wouldn't be together, but by the time the night ended, they would both have gone through the exact same spots. And then when you look at their data, even though they aren't together that often, they use the exact same territorial boundaries. It's super cool. So coyotes are definitely a very territorial species. And so when people talk about there being way more coyotes in their area, that can really only happen in a couple of ways. Either very large pack size right then, or there's so many resources present that they shrink their territories down, because they're not going to allow another pack to stay in their territory. So
Interesting. Okay, there's just a couple of more questions here. There are a couple of people who have asked about, and I've heard this also, but do coyotes lure dogs away from owners by pretending to be injured while the pack waits to ambush the dog? Have you ever heard of?
I hear of reports like that. I don't know how much credibility they have. I mean, there's no question dogs go after coyotes every once in a while, and the situation ends bad for dogs. Now, why that occurred, whether a coyote was acting injured or not, that I don't know. But obviously, I know there's lots of scenarios where coyotes go out after a dog and don't come back. And not saying the coyote necessarily did anything, but some dogs just go after anything, correct? Right? So,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, coyotes are really smart, and if they can take advantage of something, then I'm sure they're going to do it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't dismiss that happening. I'll put it that way. But I don't think the majority of dog incidences going out there is because the coyotes lured it versus the dog being brazen.
And so what is the ancestry of coyotes? What did they evolve from?
Oh. There's just the whole canid line. It all depends on how far back you want to go with that. But I mean, wolves and coyotes kind of split off a long time ago as separate species from the canid line. And so they're an offshoot of wolves, but they're not a wolf. Like they've separated long ago enough that they are clearly different species, morphologically, genetically. Like there's a lot of changes there. But they still can interbreed with wolves. So things like the red wolf out in the east, big threat to red wolves is interbreeding with coyotes.
Interesting.
And then up in the northeast, they also have had coyote wolf hybrids. Actually, the former postdoc here, John Benson, before he came here, that's what he was working on that particular project, looking at these packs that were, one member was a coyote and one member was a wolf. Definitely happens. That being said, those wolves are both smaller species of wolves. So that northeastern wolf is smaller. They're like 80 pounds, which is still a lot bigger than a coyote, but it's not like the big wolves up in Canada and some of those really substantial gray wolves.
Okay. And one of the last questions, maybe another one just came in, but speaking of packs, communication, howl versus yap versus bark. Do you know anything about their communications and what those represent?
So multiple of their calls can represent different, like the same thing and different things at the same time. So some of it is just about territoriality and letting each other kind of know where the other one is. So like howling a lot of times has to do with that longer range communication between packs. And packs, it does both. In terms of yipping and stuff, it just depends. Sometimes it's excitedness over a prey source. Sometimes it's excitedness over them seeing each other. I've seen them yipping when they're just two pups are playing and they just get excited and start yipping all over the place. So So I'm definitely far from an expert on the noises coyotes make, but that's kind of the general trend that I know of and what I've read about.
Okay. With the diets that you talked about, most of the diets that you talked about were small prey. Have you ever known or heard stories of coyotes being able to bring down a deer?
So there are places in the US where fawns are a pretty major prey source for coyotes. That's not what we're seeing here currently. However, to be fair, a lot of our work isn't done in areas where there were lots of deer. If we would have done more in the Santa Monica Mountains, we probably would see more deer in the diet versus being up in the Simi Hills and a lot of these urban patches where deer numbers just aren't very high. But that being said, also, I mean, we have seen coyotes take down deer, but it's usually an injured deer or just they harass them a lot more than they ever take by a long shot.
Okay. And the last question, and I hope please, anybody, if I missed your question, please let me know. But the last question I see here in the chat box, I know that I've heard of people hybridizing wolves with dogs, domestic dogs. And I think I've heard of it happening with coyotes, but can you verify, do dogs and coyotes hybridize?
So they can, we'll put it that way. However, most of the times when people think they have a coy dog, after it gets tested genetically, it's pure coyote. So coyotes, there are these, occasionally you'll see these melanistic coyotes and people think it's part dog. The couple that I know that have been tested, they've all came back as coyote. And I think, so one thing to think about when you start thinking about out in the wild in terms of to breed with coyotes or wolves for that matter, is that both coyotes and wolves have seasonality to their breeding cycles where domestic dogs do not. And so there's some social barriers there to kind of limit some of that interbreeding between those species. Now, it's totally possible people can make it happen in captivity, and I'm sure it has happened out in the wild and can happen in the wild, but it's definitely much less common than people think it is.
Okay. So does anybody, thank you so much, Justin. I know I just peppered you with a lot of questions.
Yeah, no, it's great. Good questions.
That shows you how interested everybody is in hearing about the work that you're doing. Does anybody have anything that I may have missed that you really wanted answered?
Actually, I just thought of one. There's that talk about putting a like a wildlife crossing like over the 101. Would something like that help in the Sepulveda Pass, Justin?
Oh, most definitely. And it's just such an expensive project, but I think that would be the ultimate fix for that issue out there, because the problem out there on the 405 is that you've got Sepulveda Boulevard there, which is a very busy road as well. Or if you go north of where Sepulveda cuts off, then you still have to deal with Skirball Road, which is also a very busy road. So there's no clean way to get them across any of the current structures. And so that would be the best fix. Now, whether that's ever feasible, just because it would be like the 101 project is very expensive, but the 405 one would be even more so, because there's so many more variables out there that they have to get across, and it's a bigger road. And so I don't know if it's ever feasible to think that that could happen. Now, an underpass or something of that sort may be more feasible. So there are things out there that go under the road currently that are stream things that could possibly be modified. I don't know enough about how they do that kind of construction to know if they could ever truly do it. But there's all these streams that go underneath the 405, but then they just go into some big pipe that then gets shipped way down the road. So there's no interconnection across the roadway through them. I tried to walk in some of them and decided that was not going to work for me. But so I think there's things that need to be thought of that are outside of that, because I don't think it's likely that we'll ever find funding to be able to put in a wildlife overpass on the 405 like what we're doing on 101. It would be great, but it would be very expensive.
There's one last question that I apologize that I missed. Somebody is asking about dog feces and how safe it is to coyotes if they eat it.
So there's lots of diseases that can be passed back and forth between domestic dogs and coyotes. So the ones that are most common are distemper and parvo. If your dog is well vaccinated and a coyote eats a scat, it's probably not that risky for them. I mean, they may pass some intestinal worms, but most of those intestinal worms aren't that detrimental to the coyotes. A lot of them have a couple of worms anyhow. I shouldn't say that, not most of them. I mean, there are plenty of internal parasites out there, and the coyotes, they have them, they pass them, they lose them, like it's kind of coming and going there. But so yes, it can be very risky for coyotes if dogs aren't being vaccinated. And that's one way to transmit, especially parvo. Now, parvo isn't super common and lethal for adult coyotes, but it can definitely kill the pups, which is kind of the same scenario with adult dogs. Adult dogs are a little less likely to die from it. They can still get it and be very sick, where pups, it's pretty much it's generally lethal without major vet care.
Okay.
So if you have domestic dogs, please vaccinate.
Yeah.
I know vaccinations get bad rap at times, but those are horrible diseases. I've seen dogs go through parvo, and it's pretty miserable.
Yeah, it's not good.
No.
Any other questions for Justin?
I just thought of one. Justin, you said earlier that the urban coyotes get up to about 30 pounds in size. The rural ones, how large will they get? About the same size, bigger or smaller?
They're all roughly the same size. Coyotes can get larger. So there's a little bit of difference between, as you go north, coyotes can tend to get a little bit bigger. And out in kind of the northeast, coyotes are generally thought to be a little bit bigger. So, but here locally, I've caught them in many different places. I picked up lots of roadkill, and I haven't seen anything that's out of the normal 25 to 30 pound range. At least not at any common. I think I had one that was 34 pounds or something, but abnormalities happen.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Justin, for taking some time to do a great presentation, and a lot of thank yous coming in on the chat box. So thank you so much for your time. And
Great questions, everybody.
Yeah. If anybody else has questions later on that they think of, let me know and we'll get them to Justin. But thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon and a wonderful holiday weekend and safe holiday weekend.
Bye. Thanks,
Bye,
Justin.
everyone.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for tuning in.
Good day, everybody.